Hello to our audience in Mexico and to all those joining us in Europe and elsewhere. I'm Érika Ruiz Sandoval, and I welcome you to the 7th online edition of the EU-Mexico Think Tank Dialogue Initiative. It would seem obvious that to face a global pandemic such as COVID-19, we would need a worldwide coordinated response. Nonetheless, the first instinct of most actors was to close borders and focus on the national scenario and national responses. However, now that the initial shock is over, it is of utmost importance to focus on cooperation, since, as Germany's Angela Merkel has said, no state, regardless of its power, can overcome this threat alone. In that sense, the COVID-19 crisis could be a golden opportunity to strengthen coordination mechanisms, global governance, and financing to truly leave no one behind. However, yesterday we saw Donald Trump's letter to the WHO, which does not seem to harbinger such a state of things. That doesn't mean it's going to be impossible, but that it's going to take a lot more work from the rest. At the United Nations, Mexico has been an active multilateral player. In late March, Mexico introduced a draft resolution on international cooperation to ensure global access to all drugs, vaccines, and medical equipment needed to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. 179 countries voted in favor of the initiative at the General Assembly and supported further collective action to respond to the crisis. The European Union is leading the response to this global emergency by taking comprehensive and decisive action. Together with the member state, the EU is adapting its priorities and programs with partner countries to address the crisis, but a lot of confrontation is going on among member states to define the recovery fund and its conditions, as well as the next 7-year budget. The EU is mobilizing more than 15.6 billion euros to enhance healthcare measures, step up testing and research, and develop a vaccine, provide crucial support to governments for the delivery of essential social services, and provide loan guarantees to boost economic activity and safeguard livelihoods, and implement regional approaches developed to tailor needs in the different areas of the world. Furthermore, the EU and its partners hosted a worldwide pledging marathon on May 4th. In a few hours, the participating partners, including Mexico, collectively pledged 7.4 billion euros in initial funding for diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines. These actions allow for some optimism in the midst of the current grim global scenario and point to the need that the COVID-19 crisis is seen as an opportunity to promote the 2030 agenda and to step up international cooperation. This can also be an opportunity for the European Union and Mexico to emphasize the importance of multilateral platforms with a strong health focus. To better understand what are the initial challenges to international cooperation understood as all types of international cooperation and all its modalities, that whether it's bilateral, trilateral, multilateral, south-south, north-south, south-north, all of the types. We will talk with Stephen Blockmans, head of the Europe in the World and EU Institutions Programs at the Center for European Policy Studies. Élodie Brun, professor, researcher, and academic coordinator at the Center for International Studies of el Colegio de México. Nicole Koenig, deputy director at the Jacques Delors Center. And Martín Olavarrieta, associate of the Mexican Council of Foreign Affairs, COMEXI, and president of the Bauer Cultural Foundation. Thank you all for joining us and sharing your experience and thoughts with us. As the conversation moves along, please post your questions on the online chat of this webinar and address them to the expert of your preference. All participants can see them, and at the end, we'll select a few of them to provide answers. Apologies in advance if we don't get to them all. Our first speaker is Nicole. In your opinion, which and why are the international cooperation priorities for the European Union? How have these been affected by the COVID-19 crisis? You have 5 minutes, Nicole.
Thank you very much, Érika. Buenos dias to all of you, and good afternoon to the Europeans. It's a great pleasure to join you from Berlin and to be part of this Mexican-European think tank dialogue. And now, before I get to the priorities of the European Union, I would just like to take a few minutes to have a look at the broader geopolitical context of this pandemic and how it looks from a European perspective. Now, as some of you will know, last year we had a new leadership in Brussels, and the new leadership started with this promise that it will shape a geopolitical commission, a geopolitical EU, and also that it will speak the language of power. And I think the pandemic and the responses that we have seen have actually accelerated some of the global trends that have led to this positioning. I just want to mention the two central ones. And I think the first one is that the great power competition between the US and China has been lifted to the next level. We have seen this global battle of narratives, as Borrell has called it, with both sides blaming each other for being at the origin of the pandemic or for failing to contain it. The second big trend, you have already alluded to it, Érika, is the deepened crisis of multilateralism. And I think the central factor here that you have also addressed is the lack of US leadership that we have seen in this crisis. And as you mentioned, I think the most recent culmination was the threat by Donald Trump to withdraw the United States from the WHO. So I think that these trends and some others maybe combined mean that there are very high expectations on the European Union to actually lead on international cooperation. And of course, the question is, can the EU deliver? And I think at the moment, if you look at the European debate, you really see two different perspectives. You see a rather pessimistic perspective, which states that an EU struggling with the political and economic backlash of this crisis will turn inwards for a while, will get stuck in this introspective self-examination. There are links being made to the time after the financial crisis, but of course adding that this time the economic implications will be tougher. But there's also the optimistic scenario, which is that the EU, maybe because of out of enlightened self-interest, will put itself in the lead internationally and will fill this international leadership gap that we are seeing. And as we are trying to be more on the optimistic side, I think we can also see that there have been some positive steps. And I think you've already mentioned some key ones, Érika. The first one was, or just going to briefly tackle three priorities that we have seen in the past months. The first was the development response. So you mentioned the EU launched the Team Europe aid package of up to 20 billion to help countries tackle the health and economic consequences of the crisis. But here, of course, there have already been some questions as to how much fresh money is really in this package, how much of it is reallocated, and of course, the bigger question, will it be enough? Now, if we look, for example, at the longer term implications for Africa, there can be some question marks. And then there are also some longer term questions whether Europeans will resist the temptation to cut development budgets in the years to come. And I think there will be also next big test coming up is the negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework 21 to 27 to see whether the development envelope will actually be raised, whether it will stay stable, whether it will be cut. The second priority is, of course, the search for a vaccine. You mentioned the EU's pledging conference raising 7.4 billion. Accompanied always with this clear message that this should be a common public good. And I think it's good news that the Chinese yesterday also chimed in on that. But of course, we will still have questions of practical feasibility, questions, what does that mean for intellectual property rights? And also what happens if the US wins the race for the vaccine. The third priority is, in light of this crisis of multilateralism, is the support for multilateral responses. The EU has defended the WHO against the attacks of the Americans, both financially and politically, and now managed to bring in this resolution and to also bring China and the US on board for the resolution in the World Health Assembly for an independent inquiry into the WHO's response. Again, I think it's good news, and we will see what happens. So just because I guess my time is probably running up, to sum up, I think we have seen some promising signs that the EU is actually willing to take this responsibility and to lead on international cooperation, but still we are only seeing the first steps. There are still some open questions, and I think there is still a danger that the EU turns inward, struggles with its own response, and particularly if we face a second wave in autumn. So that's a big question mark.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Martín, Mexico has been graduated as a recipient of official development assistance. However, as many other middle-income countries, COVID-19 has affected deeply vulnerable populations who live in poverty, and it has revealed the fragility of our healthcare system. How can Mexico play a role in international cooperation in the current crisis? How can Mexico use the CELAC presidency, pro-tempore presidency, to contribute to strengthening cooperation and the bi-regional political dialogue with the European Union? You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Érika, and good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to meet you, to the panel. Again, Nicole, Stephen, Élodie, and Érika, and the participants in this conference, the future of international cooperation after COVID-19. I would like to thank to Edna Vicencio for the invitation to participate in this webinar, and also I congratulate the European Union and Mexico think tank for the initiative of this interactive dialogue. In this intervention, I'll tell you that according to the guideline established by the Organised, as said Érika, I will address the issue of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its importance for international cooperation and the strengthening of multilateral organization. To do this, I have divided this presentation in three practical points, mentioning that in the end, I will formulate a clear proposal, a simple action, and a possible result. So the first point is, as is known, in 2015, the final document entitled Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, was adopted by the members states of the United Nations, which contained the 70 Sustainable Development Goals, the CDGs, which has proposed to achieve them in the next 10 years. The 2030 Agenda, in the context in which we're living now, means that it's a global agreement that we all have in favor of the people, the planet, and prosperity. It is our roadmap. We will define goals and indicators, and is our plan of action for this decade. The 2030 Agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as a single document have the character of the state commitment and is therefore binding on all actors and stakeholders participating in this agenda. In these times of COVID-19 and the future of the necessary international cooperation, the demand is crucial to provide spaces and mechanisms that strengthen them and link and promote participation, work, and vital collaboration about all the actors. And I refer to the governments, the private sector, the civil society, academics, the scientists, vulnerable groups, and United Nations system, as well as the stakeholders, the youth, the women, the unions, among others, to ensure that no one left behind. The second point is a conceptual. Therefore, it arises from the following question. How should we face reality in order to adjust to it? Well, this depends on how we make the approach of the real situation, which could be classified in short as a risk, as a threat, as a problem, or as a crisis. However, the 17 SDGs could coincide with any of described classification. If 70 world crises accumulate, plus other crises such as political, economics, values, among other, therefore a civilization crisis to generate. Therefore, in this case, it could be inferred that the 2030 agenda is a civilizing agenda that will allow to advance no more than ever in achieving the 70 SDGs, for which participation and commitment of all the countries that signed this agreement since 2015.
Okay, thank you so much, Martin. Stephen, after seeing the initial reaction of EU member states, what role is the European Union capable of playing in the field of international cooperation during and after this crisis? Will the EU remain as the leading donor of official development assistance? We know it's too early to tell, but is there some talk about readjusting perspectives now that some of the EU's partners, such as Mexico, will be deeply affected by the COVID-19 aftershocks? You have 5 minutes.
Thanks, Érika, and thanks also to the EU delegation and the Public Diplomacy Project for re-inviting me to a webinar of this kind. Well, I mean, your questions are very easy, of course, to answer because they are entirely speculative. There's no way of knowing just yet. I mean, I guess the overriding question here is the one that you posed in your introductory remarks. Will the COVID-19 crisis trigger even worse crises, be they economic, social, or environmental? And will they be, in your words, the golden opportunity to look at important topics with fresh eyes and new thinking? I think maybe linking up to what Nicole and Martín have already mentioned, I would like to consider three dynamics. One, the pandemic has altered the context for regional cooperation in areas of less developed countries, so Africa, poorer parts of Asia, while at the same time those main underlying issues for their lesser development remain valid. And so this will have an impact on the future of the EU's international cooperation, whether that's development or other. Second, the European Commission's increasingly geopolitical drive that Nicole alluded to risks colliding with what is called here in the media coro-nationalism of populist, right-wing led governments and member states who have a desire to politicize EU aid for their own purposes. And the third dynamic, I think, that will be a determinant for answering your questions is the recession inside the European Union, which of course will not affect only Europeans, but also citizens of less developed countries, especially in the neighboring MENA region and Africa, who, by the way, in many cases have started to suffer the economic consequences of the corona crisis even before being hit by the health effects of it. So against this backdrop, and linking back to your questions, how will the new proposal for the next 7-year budget, which is expected to be tabled in the next few days, relate to these dynamics? Will there be more or less ODA funding available? Should we expect more focus on curbing migration flows, perhaps, and therefore foresee a shift in the EU's external solidarity towards southern neighborhoods and Africa primarily? I think the answer is yes on those questions. Second, how does the EU agenda relate to that of the US and of China regarding support for less developing countries in post-corona times? Is the EU likely to be as lenient or even more lenient than other players, China in particular, in terms of debt relief? I would think so. And thirdly, how do third countries perceive foreign aid at this stage? Should the EU adapt perhaps its interests and incentives to mainly its African counterparts? I think here too the answer is yes. And then taken together, I think this will result in perhaps a more generous, but at the same time more transactional international cooperation for fewer countries in the world closer to home. MENA region, Sahel in particular, so as to more strategically serve the EU's interests. And to make two final comments still in this respect, and also to zoom in where the EU and Mexico and Latin America more broadly could cooperate in multilateral context, is I think as we see the ongoing health emergency and predictions about an L-shaped recession and a decade-long depression, push us basically in thinking about taking better care of ourselves and of the environment. I think we have to cooperate together through, the commitments we've made through a global agreement bilaterally, or through, a multilateral alliance such as the one that France and Germany set up in April 2019, to look with greater ambition to strategies to make value chains greener and more sustainable, and to work with the WHO on its One Health approach, to connect humans, animals, plants, and the environment to prevent these diseases from spilling over to humans. I think that also connects to the SDGs in a way that Martín has already talked to. So I'll end there, but I'll be happy to discuss more in detail EU-Mexico cooperation in the second round or as part of the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Élodie, what role is there for Latin American South-South cooperation with this scenario? Will COVID-19 weaken the current trends of cooperation, or will they emerge strengthened after this crisis? You have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Érika. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. South-South cooperation has been recognized as an important dimension to reach the 2030 agenda, as Martín says. So first of all, I think it is important to think about what we mean by South-South cooperation, as there is no consensus on the definition. So if we adopt a broad definition, then concessionary credits and exports of services that are not free are included. And that gives us a more optimistic view of the situation, as it allows us to include more activities that are occurring now. Latin American and Caribbean countries are both recipients and donors. And here I will focus on the second dimension. I expect that South-South cooperation from Latin America will continue to decrease in the wake of COVID-19. Indeed, this downward trend started before the current crisis because of the political and economic problems in Brazil and Venezuela. These two countries have been the two most important partners in the region regarding development cooperation over the last 2 decades. In Venezuela, the economic crisis impedes the government to keep on its cooperation projects, including those with Cuba, that is its main partner. In Brazil, since the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, South-South cooperation lost priority for the government, and the Bolsonaro administration even adopted reluctant positions regarding the Global South. Mexico is one case whose South-South cooperation may be directly affected by the expected economic recession. We can ask ourselves whether initiatives such as the Yucatan Fund to finance infrastructure projects in Central America and the Caribbean will survive. However, the amount of South-South cooperation has always been much less significant than traditional aid from northern states or other northern actors in the region. For example, at its highest level, the Brazilian cooperation reached $4.5 billion in 2010, including financial activities. It is much less than the 30 billion spent by the US the same year, or the almost 13 billion spent by France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. But I think that the main contribution of South-South cooperation has to do with techniques, ideas, and political aspirations of developing countries. From this perspective, South-South cooperation may be helpful to respond to COVID-19. For instance, we know that Cuban doctors are better prepared to work in poor and challenging places than their Western counterparts. And besides Italy, Latin American countries such as Argentina, Honduras, Mexico, and even Brazil have asked the Cuban government for help recently. So to conclude, sadly, South-South cooperation efforts will be too scarce to resolve the health emergency and the huge economic crisis that is looming ahead in many developing countries. To palliate the resource challenge, triangular cooperation between two developing countries and a third partner could be developed even more than before. And here the European Union could be an important actor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Élodie. Now I have some questions for all the four of you. You can pick and choose, but we'll have to give answers to all of them. In the end, as Martín stated, both Mexico and the European Union are committed to working towards the Sustainable Development Goals and have reaffirmed their support for the 2030 Agenda in the recently modernized global agreement. Can we keep that promise, both the European Union and Mexico? How can we cooperate in the aftermath of this crisis to really leave no one behind? Because, okay, we made the commitment in 2015, as Martín stated, but conditions are very different now. Do we still have the conditions to comply with the objectives we set up the 2030 Agenda? Also, our modernized global agreement includes a big chapter on cooperation on issues and fields such as research and innovation, education, employment, and social issues, promotion of human rights and democracy, among others. In the ongoing context of global health and economic crisis, how should Mexico and the EU implement cooperation on these issues? Also, what can we do to entice other actors, not only governments, but also the civil society and the private sector to aid in this kind of cooperation, whether it be bilateral or multilateral? And finally, what do we do with the crisis of multilateralism when we need it the most? We'll start with Nicole. 3 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot for these questions. I mean, just to maybe get to the crisis of multilateralism, I think that there is a lot of room for Mexico and the European Union to cooperate in terms of really promoting multilateralism. And I think we have already seen quite a lot of good examples. I mean, you mentioned, of course, the resolution at the UN for access to the vaccine for everyone, for equal access, where, of course, Europeans and Mexico have both supported this aim. We also had Mexicans support the EU's resolution and the WHO on the investigation from a relatively early point. And I think what could be the next step there, we have seen that China is, of course, one of the big contributors to the WHO. And I think the idea is to balance perhaps a little bit more the funding, to think together how to increase financing for the WHO to avoid maybe this imbalance towards China. But I think there are also other fora outside, perhaps, or next to the UN that are interesting. I think one of the fora that would be an interesting platform for cooperation could be the Alliance for Multilateralism, which was also co-sponsored by Mexico. And I think, you know, there's an important symbolic value, and there has been this joint declaration of the Alliance in April, pledging support to the WHO for health systems, countering disinformation, and so on. But what I think is missing a little bit in this framework is still more concrete initiatives. So one area of cooperation could also be how to translate what has happened in the UN resolution, so this initiative for equal access to the vaccine, into more concrete initiatives at the level of the Alliance for Multilateralism, and then trying to gather more countries around it. And I think more broadly, of course, you can also look at bilateral initiatives for furthering multilateralism. And I had a look at the Franco-Mexican Declaration of last year for effective multilateralism, you know, cooperating on WTO reform. I think there are really a lot of issues where the EU and Mexico, but also the EU and Latin America can cooperate in the current context.
Thank you, Nicole. Martín, is Mexico willing and able to keep its commitment to the 2030 agenda and also to work together with the European Union for a better multilateralism? You have 3 minutes, Martín.
Yes, thank you, Érika. In this second intervention, I will deal with the issue regarding the relationship between the European Union and Mexico, and even with Latin America and the Caribbean. Since 2016, the governance had been able to present the voluntary national review, and Ruiz, according to a respective handbook in the high-level political forum on sustainable development in United Nations, the headquarters of the United Nations. This is under the auspices of ECOSOC, is the Economic and Social Council, annually, and under auspices of the General Assembly every 4 years, to carry out a process of monitoring and reviewing the progress made in meeting the goals and the targets of the 2030 agenda. The high-level political forum as a mechanism and the voluntary national review are essential to work together and systematically between the European Union and Mexico. Therefore, as I told you in the introduction, I'm going to formulate the following proposal. That a mechanism for participation and interaction be established between the European Union and Mexico, together with the actor and stakeholder, always in each country, so that through the national voluntary review of each country, I said, experiences, good practices, and information are exchanged in order to know us and recognize ourselves better. In this time of the pandemic, it's better to recognize ourselves and to see to the other what's really happened, what they need. The action, the simple action, is to study the creation of a multilateral commission of the through designed official who indicate the viability of this proposal. And I'm going to finish with a possible result with this approximation of the parties, and a thematic agenda may be set to formulate a program with a common objective and strategies that allow achieving the proposal goals according to the indicators that are presented to build the future of international cooperation after COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Martín. Stephen, I understand the need for the European Union to take care of its neighborhood, of the MENA region and Africa, of course, but many have said that it will be impossible to achieve the 2030 agenda objectives if Latin America and the European Union don't work together, given the weight of both regions in the world. Do you think the European Union will have the will and the capacity to continue working with Latin America after COVID-19, not only for the sake of the pandemic, but also for the other challenges such as climate change?
Yeah, I firmly believe so. I mean, I alluded to this already in my first opening remarks, and I fully agree with what Nicole and also Martín have said on those issues. In fact, I mean, the EU will be forced, to look out more for like-minded countries around the world in order to advance its own interests and to protect, of course, its own climate and future health of its citizens. So EU and Latin American cooperation is key in this respect. And what helps, of course, is that the EU and Mexico have not only signed, concluded, their global agreement, but now also concluded negotiations on an FTA. And I think there's really tangible hooks basically that could be used in order to concretize this cooperation. This goes really into the areas of climate change and human rights and social dialogue that you also asked for in previous questions, as well as working on issues of combating poverty and researching new medicines, reducing formalities for trade in industrial products, including medical devices, which should be easier thanks to simplified trade in such remanufactured machineries. But to point also to your question about civil society and what business could benefit more. Here, the modernized global agreement between EU and Mexico, of course, includes political dialogue and cooperation, not just at governmental level, but include modalities for the organization of platforms for civil society organizations, business, and think tank dialogues such as this one, to proliferate basically and work towards a tighter fabric, on these issues across the Atlantic.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Élodie, is Mexico and Latin America as a whole a good partner for the European Union right now? How do you see the future of CELAC, for example? Mexico has the pro tempore presidency. Are we able to lead the region into approaching the European Union in order to get out of the twin crisis of the health issues and the economic issues?
Thank you. Yes, I think there are opportunities for cooperation between the EU and Latin America. And in the same way as Nicole, I would like to highlight some concrete opportunities of multilateral cooperation between both partners and the key role of Mexico right now and during the following year. Because they share some common values regarding the way to address COVID-19. And first, as you mentioned, Mexico as president of CELAC, of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, can play as a bridge between some European states and some other Latin American and Caribbean states. And Mexico proved its capacity to reach a regional consensus when it prepared the draft resolution 274 that was further adopted by the UN General Assembly last April. It was a good example of regional organization before going to the universal institution. And currently, the Mexican diplomats are working to convince their regional partners, or some of them, to link the health emergency with economic issues. That can be very interesting for the EU, I think. Second, Mexico is participating in global initiatives that seek to resolve the COVID-19 crisis in a collective way. We must remember that Mexico was the only Latin American and Caribbean country attending the Coronavirus Global Response Summit 2 weeks ago, organized among other partners by the EU and the European Council. And that was a clear response to the US unilateral suspension of its contribution to the World Health Organization. And furthermore, beyond governmental cooperation, Mexico joins the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, that is a public-private initiative to support the collective search for a vaccine and its fair distribution among countries after. So, and a last point, Mexico will join the UN Security Council next January, and it will be an ally to the Europeans and their view of on multilateralism. So to conclude, I would like to insist on the fact that it is really important that the EU supports the work initiated by Ambassador Juan Ramón de la Fuente and his team in New York, as well as the work of the Mexican Foreign Ministry to enhance trans-regional cooperation. I think that these two kind of factors are really key for any further cooperation at the multilateral level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Élodie. Now we'll go to questions from our kind audience. Nicole, you mentioned that there's a lack of US leadership right now, but is it really necessary to have US leadership? Can the EU substitute for the US in advancing multilateral issues?
Yeah, I would have picked that question too. I think it's of course necessary to have US leadership, and it's quite deplorable to have seen it lacking in the response to this pandemic. But if you think about it, I mean, in the different dimensions that I mentioned, the search for the vaccine, development cooperation, of course, the US is leading. So the US is the single biggest donor, and the US is, of course, leading in terms of the search for the vaccine. And I think it would definitely be a very good sign if, for example, the US joined the call that this vaccine should be a global common good. So the US, I think the EU can of course try to bring the US on board in several initiatives, and I think this is a little bit what we have seen now with this resolution on in the WHO, in the World Health Assembly, that we had a proposal, and the Chinese and the US were for a relatively long time not so keen to join. And eventually, they also agreed to the proposal to this inquiry into the coronavirus response. So I think the EU can or should also try to bring the US on board in multilateral initiatives. But I don't think, given the political and the economic weight of the US, the EU leadership is very necessary, but it cannot fully compensate for an absence of US leadership. And I think one point, of course, to watch out is the election and this year, because I think a lot of these policies, this America First approach to the pandemic that we have seen are, of course, tied to the president. And if we have a different president, then we might see a return to multilateralism. So that would make things much easier.
Okay. Another question now for Stephen. What are your thoughts regarding the democratic crisis that is taking place in Eastern Europe, particularly in Hungary? Do you think the far right will gain strength within the European Union because of everything that is being triggered by COVID-19?
Be careful not to single out Hungary, but in fact, approach this as a wider problem, which of course has its most sharpest expression in Hungary and Poland, but in fact, ruminates across the European Union in different ways, as governments, either caretaker governments or coalition governments elsewhere, have been imbued with emergency powers, to rule by decree, and the extension of which, of course, is to a certain extent liable to democratic oversight by parliaments, but where even in countries like the Netherlands, Parliament is able to, the government is able to steer a discussion on debates that they would like to have, rather than opposition parties represented in Parliament. But on Hungary, of course, and the move towards the right, this is a slow burning crisis which is eroding a lot of trust and solidarity within the European Union, and which will remain with us for a number of years, at least as long as those populist leaders, right-wing leaders remain in power and cannot be removed through means at the disposal of the European Union. There, it is simply not equipped to deal with those types of issues. In the meantime, I think that type of politics will, of course, determine the healthcare response, public health response that the European Union can offer. To what extent also this might become a more structural feature of EU policy in the future, and to what extent international cooperation will be determined. If you have such leaders also positioning their henchmen basically in the European Commission, responsible over budgets to roll out support programs, especially in the neighborhood, not insisting on the kind of conditionality on rule of law and democracy promotion, as is happening at the moment, then you're eroding, you know, what was commonly known as normative power Europe. And so the EU becomes, what I mentioned before, more transactional in nature.
Thank you, Stephen. Martín, COVID-19 will deepen the inequality in the world, and we've already seen that happening. That means that countries that pledged through the 2030 Agenda in 2015 will be in different conditions. Do you think we need to revise the 2030 Agenda after this crisis, or can we stick to the goals we stated back in 2015?
Érika, as I told you to the participants, now it's more important to continue with the things and agreements that we had. It's too important that we understand that this COVID pandemic obviously make like an earthquake, but I don't have any doubt that is logical, is a natural, is the agreement that signed all the countries in this moment. So if we have another agreement, if we have another, I think it's the most ambitious, because this 2030 agenda has a peculiar things. And it's very, very important that the people understand that is the maximum guideline that we have. It's the roadmap, I said. It's a plan and action, I said. Now we must continue in this decade to the 2030 agenda. There is no another. So that's the reason that my exposition is try to involve to all the actors, sectors, the stakeholders, to know what's really happening in the world, Érika. You know, in the organism, international organism, you know what's really happening, what is the lobbying, and what's really need to do with the European Union. You know the lobby, what we can do. So America Latina and Caribbean must work together in this, because we have the same problems. We have the same problems. So that's the reason that my idea that like a reflection, just like a reflection, that we proposal, plan, action, and as a result, we don't know, we have to work in that way. Okay. We have to put in ideas, ideales. This is important to the people to contribute and work together to save the persons, the planet, obviously, and we want the prosperity and to the other countries.
Thank you, Martín. Élodie, can we really work together in Latin America? Because some countries seem really overwhelmed by COVID-19. We've seen the scenes from Ecuador. We're seeing the numbers in Brazil, and we see that there are different approaches to the pandemic and different approaches to how to restart the economies after this. Can we really get to a consensus in Latin America to be a better world partner in that sense?
Well, it will be a partial consensus. Unanimity in Latin America and the Caribbean is always impossible. So that won't be a novelty with COVID-19, you know. But I think there are some space for cooperation because there is a great diversity in the region. And this diversity is not only going against multilateralism. And I think that a majority of countries and current governments is actually pushing in favor of multilateralism. And if you see at the sub-regional level, it is really interesting to see what is happening in Central America and the Caribbean. That's where regional institutions have taken initiatives really earlier than states, even earlier than their member states to give some recommendations. And I know that the current situation seems like negative for cooperation, but the fact is that Mexico succeeded in reaching a kind of regional consensus to vote and to approve this UNGA resolution last April. And that was a very interesting step. Now, where can we find some agreement? Of course, I know you are thinking about Brazil. But I think that a big challenge that we are facing in Latin America and at the global level is how can we think about cooperation without the big ones? If the big ones do not want to cooperate, what can we do? And maybe we can do some things, no? That's why maybe the EU and other Latin American countries can find some ways to promote their views at the global level. That, of course, that's a big obstacle when the US or Brazil do not want to cooperate, but you have to find collective solutions. So you have to work in these circumstances. And that's why I was thinking about a possibility of consensus, because Brazil is not the only important actor in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I think there are some opportunities.
Stephen, some of our audience members are doubting the existence of the European Union after COVID-19. Will it emerge stronger or weaker after this crisis?
Well, they say that the European Union is forged in crisis. I get a bit exasperated with questions about, of existential nature. Of course, they're essential. And they need to be better understood soberly, not emotionally. But I get a bit upset with, this kind of Nostradamus recurring prediction about the end of the world. It's always about to happen for reasons, newly revised, but never happens. I mean, could it be for the European Union? I think, we should pitch our understanding of the European Union at a different level than that of states. China has been around for a long time, and the US as well. No one questions their existence. I mean, with an intergovernmental cooperation like that of the European Union in many levels, you will have the type of Latin American splits that do not lead to consensus in policy making. But let us not forget that, the core of the European Union, to which even the most ardent Brexiteers would probably privately admit that they would like the UK to remain tethered to, is the single market. And the single market, is a very tight socioeconomic framework that all member states benefit from, even the Hungaries and the Polands and, the others that we've alluded to before. And even if some of the borders have come up in the Corona crisis, many are also eager to get rid of them and get free movement going. There was a lot at stake, and with Brexit still diluted in the minds of Johnson and his government members, and Corona being used as a kind of cloak, to sweep all the damage that Brexit would otherwise, sustain. By arguing that this is Corona, impact basically. Brexit is a harbinger, nevertheless, for other member states, to see what type of damage could be done to the strategic interests and the socioeconomic fabric that they have woven together with other member states on the continent. So I'm quite hopeful. I'm quite hopeful, in fact, that the European Union will grow, even if limited, from this crisis.
Okay, Nicole, same thing. The European integration seems to deepen every time there's a huge crisis. You got one. Do you think it will emerge stronger with more integration, less? What do you think, Nicole?
Well, I think along the lines of Stephen, I think it's not going to disappear. It's not going to be a huge winner of the crisis either, because as many have said, in this pandemic, everybody loses. But I think what we have seen is that in the beginning of the pandemic, there was quite a lot of uncoordinated action. You know, we had export bans for medical equipment and so on. And I think in the past months, things have improved. We have seen action by the European Central Bank. We have seen more supports to other member states with equipment, also with patients. And of course, yesterday we had the Franco-German initiative on the Recovery Fund, which I think is an important step, because what you often have in the European Union is if France and Germany can find a compromise, then it's easier to enlarge it to other member states. And I think what we have seen yesterday, the proposal to have a recovery fund of 500 billion based on borrowed money by the European Commission and channeled through the European budget. I think this is something that few people would have imagined last year. So the question now, of course, is whether it will get through. We have already seen some opposition from the so-called frugal four, the northern member states, but this will be now a matter for negotiation. And I think much will depend on the future of the economic response of the European Union to this pandemic. And the other issue, of course, is democracy. So the impact that this will have on democracy in the member states. I think it's also a good sign that Hungary seems to be ending its emergency status at some point soon. So these are the two things that I think we have to watch: the democracy side and the economic response.
Well, same scenario for Latin America, Élodie. If we need to watch democracy and the economy and the health of the population with Latin America, what do you think will happen?
Well, there won't be a unique solution to the current crisis. I think in some countries we will see, in almost every country we will have a big economic recession. That's one of the scarce consensus that we share in the region, that it will be very hard to recover from COVID-19. And at the political level, I think we have to see what was happening during the last years, because COVID-19 won't create crisis. It will strengthen some very difficult situations. I'm thinking about Venezuela and the way the US has tried to take advantage of the crisis to push for a change in this country. And in Brazil, tensions were very tense, and now, sorry for the repetition, and now the scenario is whether Bolsonaro will stay at power or the military will take power. No? So that's quite, for Brazil, that's not a very good perspective. Depending on which interest we are thinking about. And I am also thinking about countries such as Bolivia and Ecuador with important political tensions last year. And maybe the current crisis will exacerbate this situation after the sanitary emergency, you know. Let's see. And what is almost sure is that this crisis won't resolve all the protests and all the problems the region is facing after the last economic and financial crisis at the global level. I think from this perspective, in the long term, there will be some continuity between the two crises to understand why Latin America and the Caribbean is coming back to profound difficulties in the economy, and that will have consequences on other spheres like the political one.
Well, thank you so much, Élodie. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. There's a lot of questions still to answer, but I thank our audience for being here. We thank you, our experts, for throwing some light on the tasks ahead, particularly for the European Union and Mexico in the realm of international cooperation. I believe it's not impossible, but it will take a lot of work, a lot of resources, and a lot of political will to get out of the crisis through international cooperation, which seems obvious. Overall, I think the key concept is solidarity, something perhaps we had forgotten in the past few years, and now we realize that without it, we won't be able to overcome a crisis such as this one and the ones that are connected to it. We thank our audience for joining us and invite all of you to fill in a survey that will be sent by email. And see you here next Tuesday, same time, same place, for yet another conversation on COVID-19 related issues from a European Union and Mexico perspective. Thank you so much. Good afternoon.